and a fellow ambassador, all helping to raise the profile of Ukraine. He was highly appreciative and highly complimentary.
And you maintained an open line with him, correct?
Correct. I think there are a number of texts, some of which I have and some of which I don't, where he is reaching out constantly to me and to the others for advice and help.
Okay, we had, I think, tried to count them up. There's 215 or something text messages between you, Volker, and Ambassador Taylor, during the early August timeframe. Does that make sense to you? Is that?
Yeah, I think Taylor started in late June or early July was when he first took post, and I think we began communicating fairly shortly thereafter.
Okay, and he never communicated any concerns to you during this time frame that he had issues with what was going on?
What do you mean by what was going on?
This request for some sort of investigation.
Not in the early stages. He, as time went on, his emails began to be a little more pointed and frantic. And that's when we had very little visibility as to what was going on either. I think it had to do more with the aid and as to why the aid was suspended.
Right. And ultimately you put a period on that issue by having the September 9th communication with the president, correct?
That's correct.
And when you shared that feedback with Ambassador Taylor, was he satisfied that this issue is now behind them?
I don't really know, because he responded when I said, get a hold of the secretary. He said, I agree, and I never knew whether he reached out to the secretary or not. Okay. That was sort of the end of that.
At one point in your text, you said, let's get on the phone, right? And you said you're an individual that doesn't like to walk through these issues on text when you can talk about it on the telephone, correct?
I say that to everybody when something becomes more substantive than just a few lines of text. I say, let's talk.
Okay, and did you talk with Ambassador Taylor?
I don't recall.
Okay.
I mean, I don't recall whether we spoke right after that, whether he called the secretary. I basically, Mr. Castor wanted to get the notion across that I've gone as far as I can go with this. You need to pick up the ball. You're the ambassador. You need to pick up the ball and run with it at this point.
Okay. Just getting back to the irregular channel, did anyone else express any concerns to you about this so-called irregular channel?
I'm not sure how someone could characterize something as an irregular channel when you're talking to the President of the United States, the Secretary of State, the National Security Advisor, the Chief of Staff of the White House, the Secretary of Energy. I don't know how that's irregular. If a bunch of folks that are not in that channel are aggrieved for some reason for not being included, I don't know how they can consider us to be the irregular channel and they to be the regular channel when it's the leadership that makes the decisions.
And so the concerns, raised were never brought to a head.
Well, they were never raised.
Okay.
They were never raised. No one said, back off of Ukraine, this is dangerous, you're doing something that's untoward, we have concerns, there was a bad phone call on July 25th, there's talk about a drug cocktail or something. No one ever said that to me by phone, by text, by email. I don't remember anybody sounding any alarm bell because, of course, had someone mentioned it, I would have sat up and taken notice. Everyone's hair was on fire, but no one decided to talk to us.
When you talk in your statement about in the absence of any credible explanation for the suspension of aid, I later came to believe, it was your speculation, it was your guess, that the resumption of security aid would not occur until there was a public statement from Ukraine committing to the investigations of 2016. And I believe you said that at this point, you believed everyone knew this. Is that correct?
I think once that Politico article broke, it started making the rounds that, if you can't get a White House meeting without the statement, what makes you think you're going to get a, $400 million check? Again, that was my presumption.
Okay. But you had no evidence to prove that, correct?
That's correct. You
stated that you haven't been able to access your your records. Is that correct?
Not all of them. And there are lots of notes, records, readouts of calls, can't get to them.
But you've also stated that you don't take notes, right?
I don't take notes, but there are a lot of others out there.
And you freely admit that you know, when last I asked at your deposition, we put together a list of all the times you said you don't recall. It's like 2 pages long.
Is that all?
So, you know, you don't, on a lot of these questions, I mean, there's nuance, there are ambiguities, and we don't have records, we don't have notes, and we don't have recollections, correct?
Right. I mean, it's situational things that sort of trigger memory, especially when I'm dealing with the European Union, I'm dealing with the 28 member countries, I'm dealing with other countries that are not in the European Union that are part of my mandate, I'm dealing with the White House leadership. There's a lot of stuff to juggle. And as I said in my opening statement, a phone call for me with the President of the United States or the President of fill-in-the-blank country, while people who get a call like that maybe once in a lifetime, a call like that might be very memorable. They might remember every single thing about it. I'm doing that all day long, and I'm not saying it in a way of being braggadocio or anything like that, but it's part of my routine day. So all of these calls, these meetings with very important people tend to sort of blend together until I have someone that can show me what we discussed, what the subject was, then all of a sudden it comes back.
I mean, we're trying to get to the facts here. We're trying to find out what actually happened, what's reliable, what's accurate. Bill Taylor kept notes. He brought a little notebook in his pocket at his deposition, and he held it up, and he says, when I'm not at my desk and I'm on the phone, I use this notebook. When I'm at my desk, I use a notebook. George Kent said he wrote just innumerable memos to the file. Catherine Croft, she testified that she didn't believe George Kent's notes would be accurate. And so, you know, we have all this, you know, back and forth, but, you know, as we get to the end here, you don't have records, you don't have your notes because you didn't take notes, you don't have a lot of recollections. I mean, this is the trifecta of unreliability, isn't that true?
Well, what I'm trying to do today is to use the limited information I have to be as forthcoming as possible with you and the rest of the committee. And as these recollections have been refreshed by subsequent testimony, by some texts and emails that I've now had access to, I think I filled in a lot of blanks.
But a lot of it's speculation. A lot of it is your guess, and we're talking about, you know, an impeachment of the President of the United States. So the evidence here ought to be pretty darn good.
I've been very clear as to when I was presuming, and I was presuming on the aid. On the other things, Mr. Castor, I did have some texts that I read from. So when it comes to those, I'll rely on those texts because I don't have any reason to believe that those texts were, you know, falsely sent or that there's some subterfuge there. They are what they are. They say what they say.
Okay, thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Time of the gentleman has expired. We'll now move to a second staff-led round of 30 minutes. Mr. Volker, I just have a few questions before I turn it back to Mr. Goldman. You testified in response to my colleagues in the minority something along the lines of a lot of people did not make the connection between Burisma and Biden. I think a lot of people have real difficulty understanding that. Tim Morrison testified that I think it took him all of doing a Google search to find out, oh, this is the significance of Burisma. It involves the Bidens. Are you saying during all this time up until the call you never made the connection between Burisma and the Bidens? You just thought that the president and Rudy Giuliani were interested in this one particular Ukrainian company?
Again, my role, Mr. Chairman, was just to get the meeting.
Well, I understand that, but my question is, are you saying that for months and months, notwithstanding everything Rudy Giuliani was saying on TV and all the discussion with Rudy Giuliani, that you never put Burisma together with the Bidens?
I didn't, and I wasn't paying attention to what Mr. Giuliani was saying on TV. We were talking to him directly.
Let me ask you this. Ambassador Volker testified yesterday to a similar epiphany, for lack of a better word. This is what he said. In hindsight, I now understand that others saw the idea of investigating possible corruption involving the Ukrainian company Burisma as equivalent to investigating former Vice President Biden. I saw them very different, the former being appropriate and unremarkable, the latter being unacceptable. In retrospect, I should have seen that connection differently, and had I done so, I would have raised my own objections. Does that sum up your views as well?
It does.
Now, I think you were asked a question with a bit of a incorrect premise by my colleagues in the minority about Fiona Hill saying that, referring to a drug deal between you and Mr. Mulvaney. It was Ambassador Bolton who made the comment that he didn't want to be part of any drug deal that Ambassador Sondland and Mulvaney were cooking up. No one thinks they're talking about a literal drug deal here or a drug cocktail. The import, I think, of the ambassador's comments is quite clear, that he believed that this bargain, this quid pro quo, as you've described it, over a meeting, the investigations to get the meeting was not something he wanted to be a part of. What I want to ask you about is, he makes reference in that drug deal to a drug deal cooked up by you and Mulvaney. It's the reference to Mulvaney that I want to ask you about. You've testified that Mulvaney was aware of this quid pro quo, of this condition that the Ukrainians had to meet, that is, announcing these public investigations to get the White House meeting. Is that right?
Yeah, a lot of people were aware of it, and
including Mr. Mulvaney.
correct,
And including the Secretary of State.
correct.
Now, have you seen the Acting Chief of Staff's press conference in which he acknowledged that the military aid was withheld in part because of a desire to get that 2016 investigation you've talked about?
I don't think I saw it live. I saw it later, yeah.
So you saw him acknowledge publicly what you have confirmed too, that Mr. Mulvaney understood that 2 + 2 = 4. Is that right?
Well, again, I didn't know that the aid was conclusively tied. I was presuming he was in a position to say yes it was or no it wasn't, because
And he said yes it was, did he not?
he said yes it was.
Mr. Goldman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you again, Ambassador Sondland. We do appreciate